Welcome back. This is part 2 of my lecture on educational planning and escaping the low financing trap. Let me start then by refreshing your memory of where we had reached. We had discussed this simple equation x equals E times S, where x is education expenditure as a proportion of GDP, E is total government expenditure proportion of GDP, and S is the proportion of government budget which is allocated to education. At least 6% of GDP is needed for SDG 4, I've said. You may wonder where that number came from. Well, the number comes from another simple equation, which is that X, the education expenditure as a proportion of GDP, is actually a function of the number of learners, that is the number of children and young adults who we wish to educate as a percentage of the total population, times the cost per learner, expressed in terms of a percentage of GDP per capita. You can work through the algebra if you have time and space, or look at some of the references I just provided to you during the break. The consequence of doing that and applying it to preschool, primary school, secondary school, university and TVET and so on, in terms of the level of participation and the level of cost per learner, is to arrive at this 6% figure in countries which have the typical demography of a low-income country or a low-middle-income country, and which have cost structures in terms of the relative cost of a school place or a university place. And there are some simple truths that tend to be true across large data sets. So primary schooling is typically being delivered for 10 to 15% of GDP per capita. Secondary schooling more likely to be between 20 and 30% of GDP per capita. And university level education can be many times GDP per capita, depending on how it's organised. Now, those figures are pretty important because it is the cost per learner which ultimately determines how much money is and how much resource is needed to reach the kind of goals that people set for participation and for investment in quality improvement. It's a longer story than I can relate now, but if you look at my publication in the IIP Fundamentals series, you can see that it goes into these things in some detail. A financing trap occurs when X, proportion of GDP allocated to education, is consistently too small to finance the aspirations of national governments, or for that matter, the SDGs. We have to remember that the proportion of GDP allocated to education is not itself a particularly useful target, because it depends on the value of E and the value of S. It is setting targets for the value of E and S, which effectively determines the value of X. Many systems then have settled, as we've seen, at an equilibrating level of allocation, fall into different bands of educational effort, in most cases below 6% of GDP, and in many cases so far below 6% of GDP that it's unlikely that the majority of goals and targets will be met, certainly not by 2030, and maybe never until patterns of expenditure and cost per learner shift. We can look at the problem another way, and you can apply this simple this simple chart to data from your own country to see how it stacks up. This is the line of 6% of education for GDP. You have to sit on that line if that's what you wish to allocate. You can sit on that line in many different ways. You could sit on that line if you allocated, if your government took 20% of GDP to finance, and 30% of government expenditure was spent on education. 20 times 30% gives you 6%. So that's a viable outcome if you believe you can spend as much as 30% of your government budget on education. That's a political question. And if you can collect enough revenue to generate public expenditure of 20%. Of course, you could achieve it another way with 30% of expenditure coming, 30% of GDP being allocated to government expenditure, and 20% of government expenditure being allocated to education. That would also give you 6%. What you can't do, though, is this. You can't have government expenditure of 15% and education expenditure of 15% of government expenditure, because 15% of 15% is 2.25%, which is a huge distance away from 6% of GDP. So you can look down the current and historic allocation your government may have made to education to see whether or not they're close to the 6% target level that would be necessary in most LICs and LMICs to realise the ambitious programme of goals and targets that we now have. Well, I've done some of the work for you, but not all of it, and I'll just show you this to illustrate what the issues are. If we look at education as a proportion of GDP, which remember is dependent on how much education is as a proportion of government expenditure and how much government expenditure is of GDP, then we see that countries in sub-Saharan Africa fall into three groups. The lowest spending group as a proportion of GDP averages 2.4%. This is a huge distance from 6%. It's unlikely that these countries have the capacity in anything but the long term to increase that to levels which are closer to 6% without some kind of assistance. If we look at the other end of that spectrum, though, we have countries that are already spending 5 or 6%, or indeed even more of GDP, and should be able to finance their own education systems without substantial amounts of external financing. If they're not doing that, it may be because they're choosing to spend money on other things, or that they're not using the money they allocate to education efficiently or effectively. That's three groups of countries on education as a percent of GDP. That figure, of course, is a product of the other two columns. At least it would be if the data sets were consistent, which is not always the case. However, this is the best data we've got, and if we look at it again, we can say education as a percent of government expenditure varies in the lowest group from an average of just under 10% to 15% in the middle group and over 20% in the upper group. Whether or not this is sufficient is a good question to ask, and it does have answers. And the answer is that if you're spending less than 10% on education as a proportion of government expenditure, it would seem to be an indicator that it has a low priority rather than a high priority. If on the other hand you're spending more than 20%, you're probably giving a high priority to education, though not necessarily basic education. Of course, you may be spending a lot of money on higher education or on scholarships or on something else. So, although this is indicative at the first level of effort, without unpacking what the money is being allocated to, it's difficult to make decisions about whether or not it's an appropriate level. But it's interesting to see how much it varies from around about 6%, 7% to almost, almost 30% in some countries. This is a huge variation and illustrates very different levels of political commitment to financing education for one reason or another. If we look at the last column there on the right, government expenditure as a percent of GDP, this is a measure of how big government is, and you can see that government is actually quite small in many of the poorest countries and occupies or costs less than about 12% GDP. The average for that group is 10%. This would seem to be almost certainly not enough for a state that's big enough to finance universal access from preschool to grade 12, never mind TVET and higher education. It seems unlikely, except at very low costs per learner, that such an objective could be achieved. In contrast, high-spending countries, which have government expenditure as a large proportion of GDP, may still, of course, be relatively poor. it depends what they spend that money on and whether or not their GDP has prospered and grown or is indeed shrinking and small. So, as with the other columns, we have to unpack behind the figures to ascertain what the causes are for what may be a configuration of the key parameters which lead to low financing traps. But at least this is a start which illustrates how different things are between countries. Another feature of this kind of analysis is that it quickly demonstrates that countries tend to stick within bands. If you look at the spending as a percent of GDP over 4 years, you'll see that in that low-income group, which is spending less than 3% of GDP, the country's membership is pretty much the same over the time period. And although countries do vary a bit, it's within a relatively narrow band. The same is true for the next cluster of countries, which average about 4% of GDP. And the same is true for the high investment countries, where a large proportion of GDP is invested in education, and they average around about 6%, 5 to 6%. If we look at the other component that we've been discussing, education as a percent of government expenditure, the same sort of banded structure is apparent, although the country membership, of course, varies because they're not the same thing. Where you sit on that banded system is a signal as to what the nature of the problem of financing traps is. You can be stuck at different levels, and the course of action you might take will be different if you're at different levels. And of course it is, at least in principle, possible to spend too much rather than too little, depending on how the money is invested and how it is converted into developmental outcomes. If we then try and bring things together a bit, the question that we must ask ourselves is, what is the challenge and how do we escape from financing traps if this means that the goals that we set ourselves are unattainable? Do we change the goals, or do we somehow find ways of increasing the level of financing? Well, we know we've got a problem because what we're actually looking at is stasis with around 4% of GDP when at least 6% is needed. We're looking at SDGs and indeed aspirant governments which have rapidly increased expectations that escalate costs. COVID-19, recession and rising debt have exacerbated matters, and there are no signs, at least visible to me, that aid to education is likely to increase in the near future. Grant aid in any case can only be a small proportion of the solution, and it's important that because it is a small proportion to the solution, that it's used wisely to catalyse change rather than deliver services directly, except in extremis. There are clear limits to the amount of debt that can be relied on to lend our way out of financing crises, and the answer is that in the countries which have the biggest need, it's likely that they have the least capacity to borrow money, even concessional money, and of course even concessional money involves repayment. So new partnerships are needed which can unlock the financing trap, and this may involve revisiting some of the assumptions about how we finance education. There is a kind of taxonomy of opportunity for national governments, and indeed for partners working with national governments, which looks at the relative values of S and E and consequently of X. So those three parameters, and this is a very simple way of looking at it, can result in a low allocation of GDP per capita to education, which is insufficient to meet the goals and targets that have been set. So if both S and E, S being expenditure on education percent of government expenditure, and E being total public expenditure as percent of GDP, if both of these are low, then clearly some exploration is needed as to how they can grow. At the end of the day, without increasing these proportions, public services of the kind which exist in upper middle and high income countries are clearly unattainable. If that's politically acceptable, then maybe it's politically acceptable to have these very, very low levels of revenue collection and allocation to education systems that are supposed to be inclusive. But the simple truth is that these kind of levels, 13%, 14%, those outcomes are simply unattainable. Either the outcomes have to be modified to ones which are attainable, or new sources of revenue have to be found from one source or another. These things are all particularly context dependent, country dependent, so it's pretty impossible to generalise. But it is possible to generalise about the nature of the challenge. We can contrast those countries with countries where one or other of these key parameters is low or high, where the expenditure on education as a proportion of government is low, but the total public expenditure is high, or vice versa. These lead to different kinds of scenarios in terms of what may be the options, what may be the trade-offs. The point really that I'm trying to make here is that you can't have discussions about inadequate financing and how to resolve it without addressing questions of its causes, and some indication of those causes is provided by these gross indicators. It's a starting point which then invites interrogation at a much more detailed level in terms of national accounts and national aspirations. So what does that leave us with takeaways? In a very short period of time, it's difficult to do more than give you some bullet points. But here are some that I think emerge from this kind of analysis. First of all, this message emerges clearly from the data that goals and targets that are suitable for some countries are inappropriate for others. That we really need now to address seriously the question of diverse commitments to different goals over different time periods with different cost structures. One size absolutely doesn't fit all when we discuss these things, and we must be aware that there are different ways of reaching the same ends, and there are different ends which can be valued and should be valued. And unless we understand both of those things, we will arrive at homogenized planning models which try and pretend that one size does fit all when it doesn't. That's the first point. So we need to revisit the SDGs if we're dependent on them and say, well, shouldn't there be a banded structure of SDGs if there's a banded set of performances of countries? Shouldn't we at least admit this in detailed planning, even if at a high level we like the idea of having global goals? How do we convert these into things which are useful at national level that respect the autonomy and the essential nature of endogenous development for sustainability? Second, it is absolutely the case that efficiency and effectiveness are central to the questions of how to escape financing traps. It may well be possible to deliver far more educational services at pretty much the same level of cost by being more efficient. Indeed, if the most efficient systems were mirrored in the least efficient systems, those least efficient systems could probably educate 2 or 3 times as many young people for the same cost that they currently do. This is about many things in terms of how teachers' expensive time is used, how teachers are deployed in a way which makes best use of scarce skills, how buildings are utilised for most of the year rather than small proportions of it, and many, many other things that go into the determination of cost per learner. Smoothing the flow of learners is very important in those systems where there are bottlenecks which create large numbers of overage children and ratios of the number of years needed to produce successful graduates to the number of nominal years that they should be produced in. These things, again, can only be interrogated at a system level, but they are an essential part of the story. Though it may be difficult to imagine that revenue can be increased, There are many signs that there are opportunities to do this, both of the deliberate kind in terms of new measures to raise revenue from different sources which are underutilised, in terms of natural resource taxes perhaps, in terms of property taxes, in terms of income tax, where many people and many institutions may be paying no tax at all, despite having the capacity to so do. This is something that we can't overlook. It's also true, of course, that without changing any legislation or introducing new taxes, it should be possible to increase the collection rate. And this will happen for a variety of reasons, including digitisation, the introduction of tax identification numbers for transactions, and other things which are happening in relation to best practice on revenue generation. So we can expect opportunities to increase the amount of domestic revenue which is available to government, and of course it becomes a political and governance question as to how much of that should be allocated to education. Fourthly, we do need to look again at the costs and benefits of different aid modalities. And we need to promote aid which is catalytic rather than creates dependence. The short story on this is that the purpose of aid, of course, is to try and invoke system-level shifts that make systems more independent and more self-financing, or more likely to be self-financing than they would otherwise be. Catalytic aid seeks to use what are invariably modest inputs in relation to national budgets to achieve enduring effects at system level that persist beyond the funding of the particular aid program that we may be talking about. This is not what emergency aid does, and that's a different kind of discussion. But if we're talking about aid which is directed towards resolving financing traps, then it has to be directed towards those things which are causal in generating the trap and in generating costs which can't be sustained from domestic revenue. So we need to look again then at the idea of catalytic aid to see to what extent we can recast what we do, not in terms of filling gaps and then having to fill them again, but filling them once and for all. And lastly, we need to support the development of fiscal states. This must be the aim of development assistance, and to some extent it is likely to be a valued aim of any kind of national policy that seeks endogenous development. A fiscal state is a state which generates enough resources to provide public services at a level which is politically comfortable with. The difficulty in low and low middle income countries is that some countries have actually succeeded in doing this over the last three or four decades and are great success stories, but too many have got stuck in one way or another, either in a low income trap or, from the point of view of this discussion, in terms of a low financing trap for education, which is very relevant to the low income trap. Countries which invest heavily in their education systems have tended to grow faster than those that do not. So this is a win-win. By ensuring that education financing traps don't stall educational development and educational achievement and educational capability, then you are accelerating the chances, you're increasing the chances of accelerating economic development, which of course is essential, however you look at it, to providing educational financing and well-being to the majority of the population. Well, with that, I will leave you with just a few questions that you might like to ponder as you reflect on the messages I've sent. I think there are four quick key questions here that are worth your consideration. First, why has it proved so difficult to reach targets for educational financing as a percent of GDP and a share of public expenditure? Before trying to advocate yet again for higher levels, we have to ask ourselves, why have we been so unsuccessful over the last, not 3 decades, but actually 4 or 5 decades? We have to be realistic and honest about, is government spending simply too small to finance national and global goals? And if so, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to look again at our level of aspiration? Are we going to look again at our revenue and expenditure in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. Thirdly, how should aid and other partnerships complement national budget allocations, and how can it be more catalytic, as I've already discussed? And lastly, how can we really make a reality of increasing the number of fiscal states that are able to self-finance and can borrow in at appropriate level and finance their debt to accelerate their development without creating risks of default? So they're very good questions. They have different answers in different places. And I think they invite us all to engage with these fundamental issue, which is how do we ensure that the resourcing of education systems is adequate to achieve national goals and where they apply to make a living reality of the SDGs that relate to education. Thank you very much for listening to this, and I invite you to visit my website and the ODI website if you wish to learn more about this subject. Thank you very much.